So YouTube is a funny place sometimes. You can find pretty much anything you could think of on here, including a bunch of stuff that you don't want. Like, you could be watching a baseball video or something, and then just out of nowhere a demonstration of how dentists perform root canal just show up in your recommended tab.
There I was.
Just browsing YouTube one day, and I decided out of curiosity to look up Warren Zevon, who just so happens to be one of my favorite songwriters of all time. And what I was looking to see really was if anybody out there had done a video or videos on the career and life of Warren Zevon. And I was a little disappointed to find that there really isn't a lot of content out there on the guy. Sure, there were some reviews of his albums and a couple covers of some of his more popular songs, but there really weren't any deep dives into the life and career of Warren Zevon, which is disappointing because Zevon has probably one of the more fascinating stories that you could think of in rock and roll and just the music industry in general. His career and personal life had a pretty turbulent journey with lots of highs and lows, successes and failures, celebrations and tragedies. So I scoured the internet looking for any information that I could find on the man in an attempt to create the definitive guide to the dirty life and times of Warren Zevon. Now this is probably going to be broken up into a series of videos because if I put all this information into just one video, it's going to be like an hour long and no one's going to want to watch it. So this is part one of however many parts there are going to be in the Warren Zevon Retrospective. I'm going to go through Zevon's entire discography, give my opinions on the music, talk about the circumstances in his life at the time of each release, and showcase how he really evolved and grew both as a musician and a person from the start of his career to his untimely demise. Before we do that though, let's give a little bit of background. Warren Zevon was born in 1947 in Chicago, Illinois, to a Russian gambler for a father and a devout Mormon mother. He was taught classical piano by Igor Stravinsky, and when he reached his teenage years, he developed a passion for rock and roll music. When he hit 16, his parents got divorced, and Zevon took a car and drove out to New York City in an attempt to become a world's famous rock star. And it is here where our story begins.
I was gambling in a Havana. I took a little risk.
So from the research I've done, I'm a little unclear on where this beginning part of the story takes place, but at some point Warren formed a duo with his old school friend Violet Santangelo under the name of Lime and Cybele. I don't know if I'm saying that right. They signed a record deal with White Whale Records and released a single titled Follow Me, which hit number 65 on Billboard. Their promising start, however, was short-lived as Zevon would eventually move back to LA or just, I guess, quit the duo entirely. But Santangelo would eventually be forced to try and fail to replace Zevon. He brought in this guy named Wayne Irwin, who sung a few songs that didn't really do all that well, and Violet was eventually kicked out of her own band, following which Santangelo left the music industry altogether and became a Broadway actress under the stage name Laura Kenyon. According to Zevon's biography on AllMusic.com, he was in New York at the time Lime and Cybele formed and released Follow Me, and then he quit the group when he moved back to LA shortly thereafter. But according to Laura Kenyon's personal website, they were performing in Los Angeles. So I'm not entirely sure how this timeline worked out, but I think you get the basic idea. And the recordings of the songs Lime and Cybele did, including the ones post-Zevon, can be found on the compilation record called The First Sessions. And when Zevon got back to Los Angeles, he was approached by noted producer and talent scout Kim Fowley, who offered him a record deal and to produce his first solo record. And
I am wanted, dead or alive.
album Zevon ever recorded was called Wanted, Dead or Alive, with an album cover that for some reason reminds me of John Denver. I can't explain. This album is not typically the first one you hear of when discussing Warren Zevon, and there's pretty good reason for that, because this album is very raw and rough around the edges. This album has an amateurish quality to it, with song ideas that were clearly half-baked and unfinished, and mixes that sound like it was recorded on a root vegetable. I listened to the remastered version of this album, and the mix still sounds like crap. However, you do get some early glimpses of what Zevon would grow into on songs like Thule's Blues, a song which was actually reworked and re-released on Excitable Boy on a deluxe version of that album. Songs like Calcutta and Bullet for Ramona also foreshadow kind of the reckless abandon that would go on to characterize Zevon's breakout work in the 70s. But overall, this album listens more as a demo tape from a young, inexperienced artist still trying to find his voice. There was some turbulence in the production of this record too, as Kim Fowley left the project before its completion. According to Fowley, Zevon was stubborn, hard to work with, and refused to listen to any of his ideas. Zevon claimed later that the reason they split off was over creative differences. Fowley's premature exit probably explains why this album sounds as bad as it does from a mixing standpoint, as well as why it feels so cobbled together and unfocused. Zevon was young and naive and had creative ideas that he didn't really have the skill level yet to pull off successfully. Now, I'm not saying that Fowley was the guy here necessarily, but Zevon probably would have done well to listen to a more experienced voice guide him into the creative direction that he wanted to go. And that voice would come along about 7 years later in the form of one Jackson Browne.
On the railroad tracks, wait for the double E.
So after the commercial failure of Wanted, Dead or Alive, which was met with all the fanfare of a toddler putting on a talent show in the basement for their parents, Zevon would go on to tour with the Everly Brothers as a pianist, and when that group split in 1973, he tried and failed to release a second record before hightailing it out to Spain for the summer. But when Zevon came back from Spain, he eventually moved back to Los Angeles and shared a house with eventual Fleetwood Mac stars Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks. And at this time too, Jackson Browne was just on the cusp of blowing up into the major star that he would become. And despite their pretty obvious stylistic differences, Browne recognized the talent and ability that Warren had, and not only offered Zevon a record deal at his label Asylum Records, but also to produce his first album under the label. And thus, Zevon's self-titled big label debut came into existence. This album came out in 1976, and it put Zevon on the map, not only in the public eye, but also in the music industry in general. This album had the backing of several huge names in the music industry at the time. Jackson Browne was the producer. It had backing vocals from Bonnie Raitt, members of the Eagles, former roommates Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks, who in the same amount of time that it took for this album to release, also hit their big break as Fleetwood Mac. Linda Ronstadt would go on to cover not one, not two, but 3 of these songs from the record as well. The pairing of Jackson Browne and Warren Zevon may have been viewed as unorthodox at the time, but they work remarkably well together here, as Jackson's poppy and more polished production style helped to smooth out some of Zevon's rougher edges. But this is still definitively Warren's album. It does not sound like he's being held back at all by the production, and there is no hint of label interference or creative compromise on here whatsoever. All of the characteristics that would go on to define Zevon as an artist throughout his entire career were introduced on this record.
I'll sleep when I'm dead.
His dry wit and snarky absurdism, mixed with an aggressively cynical outlook on life that he uses an excuse to not take it so seriously, which he also entwines with this morbid fascination that he has with death and self-destruction. He also showcases an incredible knack for storytelling on this album, a skill which he would go on to perfect and improve upon in later albums. Every song on here is a self-contained story about one thing or another, whether it's the fantastical tale of two Old West outlaws in Frank and Jesse James, a down-on-his-luck heroin addict, or the innocent young girl who wants to run away with a gambling man and mama couldn't be persuaded. Zevon had an amazing talent for storytelling, but if I had to make one criticism at this record, I'm not sure that he had quite perfected that skill yet on this album. I think some of the more story-based songs on here could have used a bit more fleshing out, and it doesn't always feel like Warren really knows how to conclude some of these narratives in a way that feels satisfying. Regardless, though, they're still very compelling songs, and all of them have incredibly catchy choruses, which makes them worth listening to just for that alone.
I was caught between the ears, cost me nearly all my tears, with my back turned, looking down the path. And my mama couldn't be persuaded when they pleaded with her daughter, don't marry that gambling man. Mama couldn't be persuaded when they pleaded with her daughter, don't marry that gambling man.
Zevon also tackles some pretty dark and heavy subjects on this album, but he does it all with a strong undercurrent of sarcasm and self-satisfaction. I think he pretty thoroughly set the tone for this album when he wrote a song about two notorious American gunfighters who are generally viewed in American history as villains, and wrote them as the protagonists. That would have been the first tip-off that this was not going to be any ordinary rock album. He also wrote a song from the point of view of an ambitious pimp trying to recruit women into prostitution, as well as a down-on-his-luck heroin addict with Carmelita. Now, although that last one I don't think is meant to glorify the junkie lifestyle in any way, he does have a running theme in his early material of writing songs and stories that celebrate some pretty decidedly unsavory characters, which I think is probably how Warren Zevon viewed himself, as an unsavory character, an outlaw on the run. I can't help but think that he found kind of a kindred spirit in some of the characters that he wrote. Mama Couldn't Be Persuaded is also cool because I'm pretty sure it's based on the relationship of his parents, who, as I mentioned, one was a gambling man, the other was a devout Christian, well, not Christian, but Mormon person.
Stuck in the middle, I was the kid.
And after listening to this album again, I think it's at its best when the piano is the driving force of these songs. Zevon was a talented multi-instrumentalist, but he was a classically trained pianist, and he used that training to whip up some incredibly intricate compositions with a level of sophistication that was not very common in rock music at the time. In my opinion, the strongest songs on this album from an instrumental standpoint are the ones where he flexes that classical piano background on songs like French Inhaler, Muhammad's Radio, Frank and Jesse James, just to name a few. The only songs that I see as being the weaker ones on here is Back Turned Looking Down the Path, which feels like the most skippable song on this record. And I don't think Join Me in LA is one of the more memorable tracks on this project either, even though it does offer a pretty biting commentary on what life in Los Angeles was like at the time. That song, though, is followed up by one of the best closing tracks for an album I have ever heard in Desperado's Under the Eaves. The song starts with a slowed down orchestral arrangement of the opening piano lick from Frank and Jesse James, which I thought was a great way to bring everything full circle and give the album a sense of cohesion and completion. And it tells the story of a man on the run sitting in a hotel in Hollywood, and it ends with Zevon just humming the sound of an air conditioner in his hotel room.
I was sitting in the Hollywood Hawaiian Hotel. I was listening to the air conditioner hum. It went.
There's no lyrics after this point, just Warren musically humming the droning of a hotel air conditioner as he sits in the middle of this empty room, reflecting on everything that he's been through that led him to this point. It's masterfully done. It communicates so much without saying a single word in the lyrics, and I love the way that the orchestra just swells into this epic climax and then trails off at the end. It's a perfect way to close this album.
And if California slides into the ocean, like the mystics and statistics say it will, I predict this motel will be standing until I pay my bill.
Overall, this album was a great introduction to who Zevon was as an artist. It's crass in some places and definitely pushes the envelope of making the audience uncomfortable a few times, but it has enough moments of genuine introspection where you can still connect with it. And you definitely got an idea of who Warren Zevon was as a person, where he came from, and where he was going. This album was the big break that Zevon was looking for at this early stage in his career. It wasn't exactly a commercial hit, it didn't sell particularly well, but it still firmly established him as a talent to be reckoned with in the music industry. This album was the launching point for bigger and better things to come. Zevon and Jackson Browne went on tour together to promote this album, and when they got back, they hit the studio again to record a follow-up that would propel Zevon's career to the next level.